Welcome to topic 4502, Assessing Vulnerability and Adaptive Capacity. In this session, the central aim is to understand how planners, researchers, and decision-makers can assess the conditions that make people, places, and systems more or less able to cope with shocks and long-term stresses. The key idea is that resilient urban and regional development requires more than identifying hazards. It also requires understanding who is exposed, who is sensitive, who can adapt, and why those patterns vary across places and groups. Throughout the presentation, we will keep vulnerability and adaptive capacity connected, but we will not collapse them into the same concept. Instead, we will treat them as analytically related dimensions that together help explain how risk is produced, how it can be reduced, and how planning can move from diagnosis to action. The presentation follows a practical planning logic. We begin by asking why vulnerability and adaptive capacity assessments matter in the first place. We then clarify the core concepts and the IPCC-related framing that often shapes climate adaptation work. After that, we review common assessment approaches, including indicators, indices, and mixed methods. We then move into indicator design, because the usefulness of an assessment depends heavily on how the indicators are selected, normalized, weighted, and interpreted. From there, we discuss scale, uncertainty, and common limitations, especially the risk of treating highly dynamic processes as static measurements. The later slides focus on scenario-oriented interpretation and planning relevance, and we close with a case-based comparison showing how applied studies operationalize adaptive capacity in practice. The overall goal is not only to explain the concepts, but to show how they can support defensible planning decisions. The session is organized around 5 learning objectives. First, we need to explain the basic concepts of urban resilience, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. Second, we need to identify key assessment frameworks and commonly used metrics relevant to urban planning. Third, we must be able to analyze urban systems using basic indicators in order to assess vulnerability and adaptive capacity. Fourth, we should be able to develop a simple resilience scenario and connect it to appropriate planning strategies. Finally, we should demonstrate awareness of why resilience-oriented thinking matters for sustainable urban development. These objectives matter because they move us from terminology to application. It is not enough to memorize definitions. A good assessment must support interpretation, comparison, and action in a way that is sensitive to context, scale, and policy relevance. Assessments are useful because they help planners answer real allocation and prioritization questions. They show where risk is concentrated, which populations or systems are least able to cope, and which interventions may produce the greatest benefit. This is important for transparent decision-making, because planning often involves limited resources, multiple competing needs, and uneven levels of exposure across neighborhoods or communities. Assessments also help compare current and future conditions. A city may appear manageable under today's climate and governance context but become far more fragile under future heat, flood, or water stress conditions. Another major value is communication. Well-designed indicators make risk understandable to stakeholders who are not specialists. At the same time, the literature warns us that indicators should never be treated as neutral. They are only useful when they are built for a clear policy question, at a meaningful scale, and with explicit assumptions about what is actually being measured. This slide defines the core concepts in a planning-friendly way. Exposure refers to the presence of people, assets, infrastructure, or ecosystems in places where hazards can occur. Sensitivity refers to how strongly those people or systems are affected if exposure occurs. Adaptive capacity is the ability to adjust, cope, learn, reorganize, and respond effectively when conditions change or shocks occur. Vulnerability refers to the overall susceptibility to harm, typically shaped by exposure, sensitivity, and limits on coping or adjustment. Resilience is broader. It refers to the ability to absorb disturbance, sustain essential functions, recover, and adapt over time. These distinctions matter because they shape both diagnosis and policy design. For example, a community may be highly exposed but not highly vulnerable if sensitivity is low and adaptive capacity is strong. Conversely, even modest exposure can become severe vulnerability if sensitivity is high and coping capacity is weak. A common starting point, especially in adaptation research, is to frame vulnerability as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. This is a useful simplification because it makes the conceptual structure visible. However, we should not treat it as universally fixed. Different frameworks define these components differently, and those differences matter. Some emphasize biophysical exposure, others emphasize social conditions, institutional quality, or livelihood assets. The main lesson is that the conceptual framing should be made explicit before indicator selection begins. Once a study chooses a framing, it also shapes how variables are grouped, which dimensions are seen as causal, and which kinds of interventions appear most appropriate. In other words, the framework is not just an academic starting point. It is part of the policy logic of the assessment. A strong study states its framing clearly, and then aligns indicators, data treatment, and interpretation with that framing. Vulnerability and resilience are often presented as if they compete with one another, but in planning practice they are better understood as complementary lenses. A vulnerability lens is problem-oriented. It asks where the weak points are, where harm is concentrated, and which groups are least able to cope. A resilience lens is more solution-oriented. It asks what capacities, relationships, systems, and institutions allow places to absorb shocks, adapt, and continue functioning. Each lens is useful, but each also has risks. Vulnerability approaches can become overly static if they focus only on deficits and fail to consider learning, adaptation, and change over time. Resilience approaches can become vague if they celebrate general adaptability without defining measurable pathways or accountable interventions. The practical takeaway is to link the two. Good planning tries to reduce exposure and sensitivity while also building the capacities that allow people and institutions to respond, recover, and adapt under future uncertainty. There is no single best method for assessing vulnerability and adaptive capacity. Instead, methods should match the decision problem. Indicator dashboards are useful when the goal is to diagnose multiple dimensions separately and identify which component requires intervention. Composite indices are useful when the goal is to compare places, rank hotspots, or support high-level prioritization. Model-based approaches can help explore causal relationships or simulate scenario outcomes, especially when future conditions are central to the policy question. Participatory and qualitative methods add contextual depth, local knowledge, and legitimacy. They are especially important when formal data are incomplete, or when lived experience is essential to interpretation. In practice, the strongest assessments often use mixed methods. They triangulate quantitative indicators with interviews, local mapping, or stakeholder processes. This improves both validity and usability because it reduces the risk of producing technically neat but socially misleading outputs. A defensible indicator workflow begins with a clear decision question. Are we trying to identify vulnerable households, compare neighborhoods, support regional investment, or monitor adaptation progress over time? Once that question is clear, the system boundary, hazard scope, and time horizon should be defined. Only then should the assessment select a framework and identify candidate indicators. Each indicator needs a clear definition, unit of measurement, data source, and rationale. The assessment should also explain how missing data are handled, how variables are normalized, whether weights are assigned, and how aggregation is performed. Validation is essential. This can include checking whether indicators make conceptual sense, whether they align with local knowledge, and whether results remain stable under simple sensitivity tests. A good rule is that if a small change in weighting or normalization dramatically changes the ranking, the assessment should report that openly rather than hiding it. Indicators and composite indices serve different purposes, and treating them as interchangeable is a common mistake. A dashboard keeps each dimension visible. This helps planners understand causal pathways and match interventions to specific weaknesses, such as infrastructure gaps, weak institutional coordination, or low access to finance. A composite index compresses multiple variables into one number or ranking, which can be useful for quick comparison, funding allocation, or hotspot communication. However, that simplification comes at a price. Composite indices can hide internal trade-offs, obscure inequalities, and create a false sense of precision. Two places with the same score may have very different underlying conditions. They are also highly sensitive to technical decisions, especially normalization and weighting. For this reason, a composite index should be used only when the policy question truly benefits from ranking. If the goal is diagnosis and targeted planning, disaggregated indicators are often more informative and more honest. Adaptive capacity is multidimensional, and one of the most common ways to operationalize it is through livelihood and capital-based dimensions. Human capital includes education, skills, health, and knowledge. Social capital includes networks, trust, reciprocity, and collective action. Natural capital relates to ecosystem services, environmental quality, and access to land or water. Physical capital includes housing quality, transport, infrastructure, and service access. Financial capital includes income, savings, credit, insurance, and other resources that improve flexibility. Many studies also add institutions and governance because rules, coordination, learning, and implementation capacity strongly shape whether people can actually act on available resources. The important point is not to measure every possible dimension. The key is to choose indicators that fit the place, the hazard, and the planning problem. A useful adaptive capacity assessment connects indicators to real levers that planners, institutions, and communities can actually influence. Scale is one of the most important, but most misunderstood issues in vulnerability research. Conditions that matter at the household scale may look completely different at the neighborhood, city, or regional scale. A city may appear highly capable overall because it has strong municipal institutions, but some neighborhoods may still be extremely vulnerable because of poor housing, weak services, or social exclusion. Likewise, indicators that seem appropriate for regional comparison may be too coarse for local planning. Context also matters because identical indicators can have different meanings in different places. Access to water, road connectivity, or social networks may shape adaptive capacity differently depending on governance systems, livelihood patterns, environmental stress, and existing inequalities. Cross-scale interactions matter as well. Local outcomes are often shaped by national policy, infrastructure systems, migration, markets, or climate processes beyond the local boundary. This is why robust assessments combine spatial evidence with local knowledge and avoid over-relying on a single summary score. Recent reviews of community-based vulnerability assessment show that the field has made progress, especially in moving away from narrow sector-by-sector approaches. However, several limitations remain common. Many studies still do not handle spatial scale carefully enough. Others do not incorporate future time horizons clearly, even though climate adaptation requires attention to changing rather than static conditions. A third limitation is the weak treatment of multiple interacting stresses. Communities rarely experience a single isolated problem. Climate hazards interact with livelihoods, institutional weakness, environmental degradation, and social inequality. Another gap is uneven treatment of adaptive capacity components. Some studies measure livelihood assets carefully, but give little attention to learning, governance, or institutional flexibility. The planning implication is clear: community-based assessment should be strengthened through participatory mapping, scenario-oriented thinking, and an explicit effort to connect local evidence to broader structural processes and future change. An applied example from Central America illustrates how vulnerability and adaptive capacity can be mapped by combining biophysical and socioeconomic information. In that case, projected impacts on climate-sensitive livelihoods, such as agriculture, were paired with indicators of adaptive capacity in order to identify spatial differences in risk and adjustment potential. Ranking and descriptive multivariate methods were used to identify gradients and clusters rather than assuming that one number fully explained local conditions. The value of this kind of work lies in translation. Once patterns are visible, planners can ask where investments in innovation, services, infrastructure, or livelihood diversification may be most needed. But the example also reminds us that maps are not self-explanatory. Their meaning depends on how indicators were chosen, how variables were weighted, and how categories were constructed. A compelling map can still be misleading if the method behind it is weak or if uncertainty is hidden from the users. Scenario thinking helps convert assessment outputs into planning tools. The first step is to select one or two priority hazards and define the planning unit clearly, such as a neighborhood, municipality, district, or region. The next step is to build a baseline indicator profile that reflects current exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Then comes the stress test. How might those indicators shift under a plausible future condition, such as more frequent heat waves, more intense flooding, population growth, service disruption, or land use change? The point is not to predict the future exactly. The point is to identify where current systems are brittle, which indicators are likely to worsen, and which strategies remain effective under different conditions. A simple scenario can be very powerful because it forces planners to compare options not only for immediate benefit but also for robustness. In this sense, scenarios create a bridge between assessment, uncertainty, and strategy design. Once assessment results are available, planning actions can be organized around three broad levers. The first is reducing exposure. This may involve land use planning, zoning restrictions, protective buffers, or in some cases relocation away from high-risk areas. The second is reducing sensitivity. This includes measures such as housing retrofits, stronger infrastructure systems, improved public health measures, heat risk management, and service continuity planning. The third is increasing adaptive capacity. This involves investments in services, social protection, learning systems, governance quality, coordination, finance, and risk-sharing tools. Good adaptation planning rarely relies on only one lever. The best strategies combine no-regrets actions that are useful under many futures with targeted investments guided by evidence from indicators and local knowledge. In this way, the assessment becomes actionable. It helps decision-makers see whether a proposed intervention actually addresses exposure, sensitivity, capacity, or some combination of the three. A strong assessment is not only technically organized, it is also transparent and ethically alert. Transparency means stating definitions clearly, documenting data sources, explaining how variables were normalized, showing whether and why weights were applied, and reporting how aggregation was performed. Uncertainty should not be hidden. Simple sensitivity checks can reveal whether results are stable or whether they depend heavily on technical assumptions. Ethics matter because average scores can conceal inequality. A place may look moderately vulnerable on average while containing highly exposed groups that bear most of the burden. Another ethical issue is maladaptation. An intervention may reduce risk for one group while shifting costs or exposure onto another. For this reason, constructive framing is important. Rather than producing fatalistic labels, good assessments identify feasible pathways, capacities to strengthen, and groups that need targeted support. The goal is not only to measure weakness, but to support fairer and more effective action. The two case studies included in the presentation show how adaptive capacity can be operationalized differently depending on the setting and research purpose. The Bhutan case in the Nikachu watershed combines household and village-level indicators with landscape-related measures to assess adaptive capacity in a resource-dependent community. Its value lies in showing variation within communities and linking livelihood security to broader environmental conditions. The West Bengal case uses the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework and applies analytic hierarchy process weighting to evaluate adaptive capacity across farming households. It identifies differences across natural, physical, and financial capital and links capacity patterns to observed adaptation behavior. Taken together, the cases show that adaptive capacity is not a single variable and should not be treated as such. It is context-specific, multidimensional, and often best interpreted when quantitative structure is paired with local livelihood understanding and attention to how people actually adapt in practice. To conclude, vulnerability and adaptive capacity are central concepts for resilience-oriented planning, but they must be used carefully. Definitions matter because they shape frameworks, indicators, and the meaning of results. Methods must match the policy question. Dashboards are often better for diagnosis, while composite indices can be useful for prioritization if they are transparent and tested. Scale and context are not secondary details, they fundamentally affect interpretation. The strongest assessments combine quantitative evidence with community knowledge and scenario thinking, because planning decisions are made under uncertainty and within uneven social realities. Most importantly, assessment is not an end in itself. Its value lies in improving action, reducing exposure where possible, reducing sensitivity where impacts can be softened, and strengthening the capacities that help people and institutions respond, recover, learn, and adapt. That is how vulnerability assessment becomes meaningful for resilient and sustainable urban and regional development.